Okay, so Sherry, you and Josie can go ahead and start anytime you'd like to now.
All right, great. Well, welcome everyone who's on today. Thank you for joining. Our Lunch and Learn today is provided through St. Mark's Hospital, the Healthy Conversations, and the title is Meal Planning for Success. And we have Josie here that will be presenting. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn the time over to her. And thanks again, everyone, for hopping on.
Okay, I'll try and, hi, my name is Josie. Oh, perfect. Can everyone see me? I don't know if it's good to have the video on or not, but is it okay, like, I'd rather you see the screen than me. Is the screen okay? Can everyone see the screen?
I can see the screen.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, great. So my name is Josie. I'm a dietitian, and I work here at St. Mark's Hospital in their outpatient metabolic nutrition services clinic. And yeah, I see patients all the time, and they're not inpatients, so they're not actively unwell, but they come in based on their doctor's referral, and we discuss a lot of it's technically a type of therapy almost, and we talk about ways to improve specifically food in their lives, and that is something I do and very passionate about. So I'm excited to talk today about meal planning specifically, because I think this can be a hard thing for a lot of people, and it can be a barrier in a lot of ways to making progress and making or improving their health, just because food is a huge component of that. So we'll talk a little bit about why meal planning may be difficult, and how to kind of overcome some of those challenges, so that hopefully you can be a little bit more successful at it going forward. Oh dear, I'm trying to think of how to navigate this best. Okay, there we go. Okay, so I think just first, let's just kind of talk about why meal plan. Why is this something that why do we talk about meal planning, and why is it something that could be a positive aspect of someone's life? And so there's kind of maybe a lot of reasons why people really like it, people that do it regularly. But I think the biggest ones are that just eating at home is usually less expensive. And I put usually in quotations because you can definitely purchase very expensive cuts of meat, for instance, and shop at maybe more expensive grocery stores, and it can get a little bit pricier based on that. But there's definitely ways I would say across the board, eating at home for the most part is more economical than getting it prepared at a restaurant. And then I think another big thing is that you have way more control of what you're eating, and so this could be a preference thing. You just you can decide what types of food you like, and if you don't like certain foods, if you're feeding a family with maybe lots of different preferences, then making food at home has the potential to you have more control over that. And then there's the nutrition aspect too, which we'll talk more about. But yeah, you have the nutrition aspect. You can control a lot more of that. You can maybe you're managing a disease such as diabetes. It's easier to manage that disease at home, where you can know exactly what you're eating and what types of food you're including in the meals that you're making. Another good reason, or I think meal planning can be really helpful, is that you can just genuinely practicing some of those cooking skills, which are life skills that can hugely impact your rest of your life. So that's a big, huge thing of a plus for meal planning. It could add a lot more variety, and I think this is it's potential, because I think there's obviously a lot of restaurants out there that offer a lot of variety, different types of restaurants, different ethnic foods, all of that. And sometimes feeling eating at home can be the same things over and over and over again, and that has usually more to do with just maybe not having a lot of confidence, I guess, preparing a lot of different foods for yourself and your family. And then I guess meal plans, family meals, there's a lot of benefits of eating as a family if you are in building relationships, whether that's a family or friendship relationship or roommates or whatever it might be. That is a huge plus, when you're sharing food with people on a regular basis, build relationships that way. So that's a big plus. And then just traditional cooking, family recipes. Food is culture, and definitely restaurant food is culture too, but a huge component of food culture is made in the home, prepared in the home. It's passed down. It's relationship building. It's learning how to cook. It's technique. It's flavors. It's ingredients. It's everything. And so there's huge impact just like socially and culturally in a community and in family when we prepare food at home. And I think that's a huge plus, and why meal planning can be a big reason why like eating at home versus eating at a restaurant. So okay, and then I think just like going over some common barriers to meal planning, and I kind of just like pulled these from, I don't know, I talk to patients all day and we talk about maybe barriers to meal planning. It's just kind of the more common ones I hear. Time, maybe some of these resonate with some of you guys, but yeah, time is a big one for a lot of people. People have busy lives. I get it. And I say, and I don't know, like, I don't think it's as easy just to say, well, reprioritize things in your life. It's not so simple as that. I get that. So time is one of those big ones. Organization, I think just like being organized in general can be really challenging to get started with. And I think that's kind of the whole idea of meal planning, is it's like there's more organization around food in your lifestyle. Picky eaters is a big common one, especially with kids, though I will say also adults. I think we always put picky eatiness on kids, but I know a lot of adults who or like a patient and then their spouse maybe is the picky eater, and that can add some challenges. And also like food allergies and intolerances, whether that's yourself or someone that you are preparing food for, can be a big barrier for sure. And then I think we kind of talked about it before, but like lacking skill or confidence with cooking, or like what we call self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is this idea of like your belief that you can do something, whether you can do it or not, but it's based on the belief. So that can be kind of in this confidence area, just like maybe lacking some of that. Dislike cooking, it's a big one, honestly, just like not liking it. And that, yeah, can be a huge barrier. Limited kitchen space, just like not having a lot of kitchen space, or I also think like along with that, just not having a lot of kitchen equipment, or you know, you have a recipe and it says you need to use this type of pan, and you're like, I only have one saucepan and it's not that size, and it makes cooking difficult. That can be definitely a limiting factor. And then I think another big one is just like just don't like feeling limited to a meal schedule. And I think that's a big one. People just like don't like the idea of having to stick to a schedule, or they try meal planning and they just, all the ingredients end up just going bad in their fridge because they don't actually ever make the meal. They don't ever execute the plan because they don't feel like eating it in the moment. And then I think another big one is cleaning up the kitchen after. That's a big one for a lot of people. They just don't feel like they want to clean up the kitchen. I'd also put this one into, I didn't put it in there, but I was just thinking of it. Another big common one is mobility. I met with a lot of different patients, and some that will say that it's just mobility. It's hard for them to stand at a kitchen chopping vegetables for that long, or then afterwards cleaning up those dishes is challenging. So I can definitely see that as a limiting factor and a barrier. And I put this nice office meme quote thing that I don't hate it, I just don't like it at all, and it's terrible. And I hope that we can get past that about meal planning, because it can definitely feel terrible, but I think it can definitely bring a lot of like, I don't know, organization, zen into your life when we figure out food in a way that is, I don't know, like positively impacting your life rather than negatively. Okay, so what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about simplifying meal planning. I think when we think about meal planning, it's like this really complex daily, weekly thing, and it has a lot of details, and I don't think it has to be so hard. We can definitely simplify it. I think we're going to talk about adding variety, and I think that's another barrier. It's just like that people feel like it's just, I only know how to make 5 things, and how do I continue to add variety to that? We're going to talk about respecting nutrition and satisfaction when we're planning meals, because that can help with making food at home more enjoyable. And then we're going to address just a couple barriers, which is picky eating and like the time management problem. So we'll start with meal planning, simplifying it. So I think I always like to start when I'm meeting with a patient or anyone really, and we're talking about meal planning, I'm like, okay, let's get out of our heads this idea that meal planning is, if you're going to do meal planning, you have to do it every single day or every meal, or at least dinner meal, 7 days a week. And you have to sit there on a Sunday and you have to fill it out and put it on a calendar, and that's what it looks like for meal planning for your family. I think like let's remove that idea and kind of open up this idea of asking yourself, okay, what is actually realistic for your family or you, and what's like realistic right now? Start. If you don't have a meal plan currently, where's a good place to start? And so yeah, so like kind of asking yourself, like, is planning a dinner meal every night right now realistic, or is planning lunches more realistic? or is planning only 3 times a week that, like only 3 meals a week that we're planning at the start? Is that what's more realistic? There is really no right or wrong way to do this. Starting small. I always encourage everyone just to start really small. If you're not doing any planned meals at all, meaning you have not thought of a meal ahead of time and executed it successfully really yet, then let's start really small. Aim for maybe 3 meals a week at first or less. You can even start with just 1 and start building every week. So start with 1, and then the next week 2, and then 3, and then even you can do 3 for a while and just get a good hang of it. So I think definitely start small. Or some people like the approach of, like, they'll only think of, every 3 days I think of 2 meals. So there is less planning at one time, but maybe there's more planning throughout the week. And some people like that approach as well. It just kind of depends on your lifestyle. If you like going to the grocery store more than once a week, then that can be a good approach. If you prefer to go to the grocery store once a week or do like a grocery order where you go pick it up, which is a good option, that could be another thing too. So we'll talk about like the calendar. I think some people, when they think of meal planning, they have in their heads like this calendar with all the days on it and you write it in. And yeah, so I think there's kind of some pros and cons to the calendar approach, whether that is like a physical calendar you write in, whether it's a Google Calendar, electronic, whether that is just in your brain or it's written in a notebook or whatever, or on a chalkboard. I think some pros of it is that you only have to think about it once per week. So if you do a meal plan for 7 days, or if you're just doing the 3 days a week, you're only doing 3 meals a week, you only have to think about it, and you're just going to put them in your calendar. It's nice because you don't have to think about it once, rather than going back to thinking about it every single day. It can add structure to your week. I think this one is, and then this actually goes down to this very last bulleted point here. It says plan. You can plan to prepare simpler meals on busier days and more complex meals on less busy days. I think that kind of goes back to the structure too, because I think it's totally realistic to be, it's totally valid to be like, yeah, on Wednesdays, it's a really busy evening because my son has a sports game or something, or my daughter has dance, or vice versa. And that can be definitely like a barrier. It's like, I have all these busy days, I don't have time to go home and make a meal. And so that's where like add structure, because you can look at what's already kind of in the schedule, like, okay, I have this event, I have this extracurricular activity for my child. I know I'm not going to get home till later, but then on this day, it's pretty simple. Everyone comes home, we're just chilling. I have maybe run one errand, but for the most part, it's pretty chill. I probably have more time to make this more complex meal. Or maybe that day, the busy day, is just like, I'm just gonna plan to eat out that day. That's just the plan. That's part of the plan. That's fine as well. So there, add structure. Simplifying the food prep. I think this is like, if you have an idea of like what you're making throughout the week, then you can maybe do some like pre-prepping, which we'll talk about a little bit later, more specifically about that, but like doing some pre-prepping ahead of time, because you kind of have a good idea of like, okay, I'm gonna chop these now, I have time now, so that this makes it a faster meal when I'm actually making it, which can help people be more successful. And then like last thing is just your produce, just less likely to go bad because you actually have a plan for what day you're going to use it. And so it's not just something a lot of people think. If you don't do the calendar approach, which I think the non-calendar approach would be, I should say first off, is you think of 3 meals. Let's just say that example, 3 meals, you think of 3 meals, and you aren't putting it on a specific day. So you're not saying, I'm going to make spaghetti and whatever all the sides are on Monday, and I'm going to make salmon and whatever on Wednesday, and I'm going to make the tacos, we'll say tacos on Friday, right? So that's what I would be like, more of a calendar approach. A non-calendar approach would be where you are just saying, I'm going to make these 3 meals sometime during the week when it makes sense. So you have a plan, you've made a shopping list, you've found the recipes, but you've done all that part, but you haven't associated with a specific day. And so that's an option, and some people like the fluidity of that. The con of that, I guess, would be that it's like you might have like produce going bad in your fridge because you're like, oh, I don't really feel like eating that this day, and then you might not ever feel like eating it, and then it just goes bad. I think that's kind of the issue there. But okay, back to the calendar approach though. So a con of the calendar approach is that plans may change unexpectedly. I think that's a big one. It's like you expected to make this meal on this day, things changed, didn't happen. So it's sitting in your fridge, and now you don't have a plan for it anymore. And then the other con is that we kind of talked before, but like just feeling like not eating tacos on a Tuesday. Like you just don't feel like eating that food on that day. And so you don't have as much flexibility with the calendar approach. So it's definitely a big con. And that would be, I guess, a pro of doing the non-calendar approach. So you could flip those. Okay, so another approach you could do is you could simplify by adding daily themes. I know some people really like this approach where it's more this is helpful for like the thinking of what am I going to make during the week. So I think that can be a limiting factor, meaning that you're just like, I don't even like know what I like to eat or what my family likes to eat, and I can't even think of meals to think of to add to my calendar. So this could be helpful in coming up with a theme. And this is just an example of different themes for different days. You can definitely come up with your own. So I just came up with this example of like Monday. It's really typical to do like a meatless Monday. So like specifically a vegetarian meal. Tuesday, I just put like ethnic. So this could be like any other culture recipes. Maybe for your family, you like to do tacos on a Tuesday. So that could be a Taco Tuesday, but maybe for another family, it's different. Wednesday, like just breakfast for dinner. So that kind of like there's like a realm there. It can vary from like omelets and skillet meals to like maybe more pancake and eggs and that kind of thing. Thursday, you could add some fish just because I always try to encourage people to eat more fish in their day, in their lives. So yeah, having like intentional fish dishes. Friday, I like the idea of a freebie Friday. So it's just kind of like, this is if there's any day, it's just a flexible day. And for some people, maybe people don't like this because it's like you're basically not having any plan. But sometimes it's helpful to have just kind of a day where there's just like nothing planned. So you have some flexibility. So this is kind of where you can put maybe you have some backup frozen meals that are just super fast and easy. You put them in the oven, done. Maybe it's just a takeout day. Maybe you're having pizza on a Friday. Maybe it's a restaurant day. Maybe it's just like we have things in the fridge we need to eat, leftovers day, etc. Maybe it's breakfast cereal day. It's just a freebie Friday. Anything you want. Saturday, family favorites. So these are kind of just like your tried and true recipes that maybe don't fit in a specific category. Maybe they do, but just like the family favorites that your family likes specifically. And then Sunday, I like the idea of like a traditional or classical cultural meal. So whatever that looks like for your family and culture, that's a good one. And then or a newbie recipe, which I think and maybe some of these will always be newbie recipes. But like a place if you're like, I really want to try this. It doesn't really fit into any specific type of category, I guess, but I really want to try this recipe. That could be Sunday could be a great day for that. So that's just an example, and that can really help people just for the planning process of like thinking of the foods again is kind of having a theme. Okay, so we're gonna talk about some adding variety. So now that we kind of like figure maybe you've had some more ideas and like the planning part of just like how many meals am I going to make? Do I want to use a calendar? Do I want to make it more flexible? How am I going to start adding variety to my meals? And we kind of like talked a little bit about that, like adding variety with the themed days. And like it's a barrier sometimes to think of the meals and then, or you only know how to confidently execute a few. Sometimes very frequently I'll use the 3 meals method approach. And the 3 meals method approach is like really when you're sitting down to meal plan and you're thinking of really 3 things for as far as like planning a recipe. You're planning for only one brand new recipe or meal. If your issue is I don't have a lot of variety, I don't have a lot of recipes that I can just pull out of my recipe book and I can confidently execute. This is a really great way to add variety. Is you're thinking of only one new recipe. You're going to start. You're going to plan for. You're going to plan for another meal that you have made before. So you have done it before. You know you like it. You know the family likes it maybe, but you don't make it that often. One of those. And then the third thing is you're going to plan for a meal that you make very regularly. You are very confident executing it. Your family likes it. You know it's going to go well. No problems there. Even sometimes I'll even encourage this to even have a 4th option or to make the 3rd option a meal that you can always have on hand. So it's just like a constant, every time you go to the grocery store, you're like, okay, am I stocked up on all these ingredients to make this specific meal? So that if there is ever a day that you're just like, there's nothing in the house to make, I don't want to go out to eat, or it's just not convenient to go out to eat, and I just want to make something here at home, and I want it to be fast, and I want to know how to make it, and you just like need that kind of meal, that could be a good one to make. Just always have ingredients on hand, and that sometimes I'll encourage for that third meal, or make a fourth planned meal. And the reason for this is like we want to avoid adding too many new recipes at once, because that can get really overwhelming. I think it's really typical to like, you go on Pinterest and you find all these new recipes and you try one and it doesn't work out, or it wasn't a good recipe, or maybe you weren't as skillful as you thought you were, or you're maybe still learning, and that's great. And so it just didn't go as well. And so that kind of is like, oh, it didn't go well. And then you're looking at the rest of your week and you have all these new recipes you found, and it's just maybe shot your confidence a little bit. So I always encourage, like, really try not to do more than one new recipe a week if you can. I mean, you can always do more, but I think that can get a little overwhelming. So I always kind of just encourage, like, just try one at least, or just one at most, I think, and then make more recipes that you know how to make. And then over time, eventually, like, you'll just like build up a bunch of recipes that you can pull out of your recipe book that you've made before, that you've confidently executed, that you know you like, and some of them you're probably not going to like, and that's okay, you can throw it out. But I think this is a good way to build confidence, build self-efficacy, and then like add variety so that you have more options at home, and it's less enticing maybe, or just like, I don't know, like going out to eat doesn't feel like the best option, I guess. Okay, and then I think like when we're adding variety, like where to find new recipes, I think this is a common one. Pinterest is a really great resource for this. I use Pinterest all the time for this. Specifically, I will type in ingredients I have on hand. So if I like have just like this random bell pepper that I'm like, I need to use this, it's gonna go bad, or I have this leftover chicken from another thing that I need to use, or vice versa, all these, various random canned ingredients, whatever it is, I just will type it into the Pinterest search bar and like, put some other keywords like recipe, or I have some other ingredients I want to include with it, and just see what pulls up. And that's a really great way to use what you have already on hand, and find something new. And so that's a good way to do it. Or you can if you don't even have specific ingredients you want to use, you can just type in some keywords. So like you type in 30-minute meals, or type in vegetarian meals if you're trying to do more vegetarian meals, or a breakfast for dinner, or other, all sorts of other keywords that kind of just can bring up lots of different recipes that you can kind of search through. Another approach I like to do is like when I'm at a restaurant, I always I'll be looking on the menu and I'm like, do something, and if I really liked it, I'll like often go home and like Google search, that type of restaurant or the type of food from that specific restaurant, and like I'll do like a copycat recipe search. So someone who maybe has recreated it before, or you could recreate it just on your own volition without a recipe if you feel confident with that. And I've done that too. But I like that approach because it's like you've tried something, you like it, so there's like that's already a good sign. And then now you're just finding it to make again, and then that's something you can make in your home for your family. So I'm trying to think of one that I've recently done of that. I really like the from Cubby's restaurant, the like kale, wild rice, chicken salad thing. I recently did like the same thing, Google searched that, whatever that is called, copycat recipe, and now it's something I make on a regular basis at my own home, and it's much cheaper that way. And but it's like that's an example of that. And then another thing you can do is ask your friends or families for their recent favorite recipes or family favorites. I love that idea. I think people should just share more of what they're doing in their own homes for food. I see like frequently people on like my Instagram, like my friends that I follow will like just kind of like on their stories especially will just put out like a little box where you can type in a little comment, just asking for recipes or asking for like just even like types of meals, just because they are trying to advance their meal plans. Because I think this is something that people run into, is just adding variety, because it's doing the same things over and over and over again can sometimes get a little old. So that's another approach you can do. Just ask the people around you, Facebook, Instagram, in person, ask your coworkers, all of that. I think that's a good approach. Okay, so now we're going to get to the section which is talking a little bit about nutrition and satisfaction, because I think another big barrier to meal planning is that it's like partly because food just gets a little sometimes old at home. It's like the same things over and over again, and like eating out is exciting and it's fun and it's always tastes good, and there's that piece of it, and it's just like very satisfying. And whereas home maybe doesn't feel like it has the same type of satisfaction all the time. And so I always like to try and encourage that we kind of bring both nutrition and satisfaction when we're thinking about meals to the table. So what is satisfaction? When I say that, what does that mean? And I think this really is just that, like, these are foods you enjoy eating purely because you like the taste and the texture, or maybe it's like a family food, or it's a cultural food, or it's like basically it's your motivation for eating it is not nutrition. You're not eating this because you're like trying to build muscle, essentially. Not saying that, and I guess I should always put a caveat that like the satisfying foods make food meals enjoyable, but that doesn't mean that they aren't nourishing too. I think that there's like a big idea that like just because a food is fun does not mean that it is not nourishing, because they can definitely be the same. And then like, what is nutrition? When I say that, what is nutrition? And I think nutrition essentially is foods that our bodies need to function. So these are fiber, carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. These are our macronutrients, and there's a lot of micronutrients. That's our vitamins and minerals. And so these are kind of like foods that, you know, our body needs to function, our body functions and feels best on. And I think at the end of the day, really, like, nutrition is balance. And really all foods are nourishing foods. So it kind of goes back to that satisfaction part too. It's like, yeah, maybe we really like pizza, because I like pizza. Most people like pizza, I feel like. And people are like, I don't know, it's not like a very nourishing food. And it's like, yeah, like it maybe it's not, our body maybe doesn't feel always the best eating pizza, but it's still giving us some nutrition. Like, it still has carbohydrates, it still has proteins, it still has fats, all those things our body needs. But it maybe is lacking things like fiber, maybe some like vitamins and minerals, vegetables and stuff like that. So we really want to try and add balance, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But really, your motivation when we're talking about nutrition, we're eating for nutrition, is your motivation for that is primarily nourishment. We're primarily eating not because it necessarily tastes good or is great texture, taste, whatever, but it is because it nourishes our body really well. And then these foods can be satisfying. I think that's the other thing too. It's like, just because it is primarily for nourishment doesn't mean that they can't be satisfying as well. They can definitely be all one. So we're going to the next page. So respect of nutrition. So all bodies function on a balance of nutrients: proteins, again, starches, sugars, fats, and fibers. And the main, I guess we'll kind of go over just like what I mean by protein, starches, sugars, fibers, and fats, just so everyone's on the same page. But proteins, talk about proteins, we're primarily talking about like meats, animal meats, fish, poultry, dairy, eggs, nuts, seeds, including nut and seed butters, beans, lentils, including bean and lentil products like hummus, soy, including soy products like soy milk, edamame, tofu, etc. Starches, so starches, sugars, and fibers, I should put a caveat, these are all carbs. So when we're talking about carbs, what we're talking about is starches, sugars, and fibers, but they're three distinct types of carbohydrates. So starches are coming mainly from breads, pasta, rice, potatoes, corn, peas, beans, oats, etc., all sorts of other grain type products. Whereas sugars, a lot of times sugars and starches are in the same food, but not always. So like sugars like fruits, syrups, nectars, honey, sweetened foods. There are also a lot of sugars just naturally found in a lot of starches as well. So you'll kind of get them both. And then fibers are found in fruit, vegetable, whole grains, beans, lentils, nuts, and seeds. And fibers are important because they don't give us any energy, like they don't feed our brain, for instance, but they do keep our digestive system really healthy. They help with heart function and keeping our heart healthy. So there's a lot of good benefits for fibers. And a lot of times, because fibers, sugars, and starches are all carbohydrates, they can all be in sometimes all the same food. A good example of that is beans are a great example of this. So beans have a lot of fiber. They're going to have some sugars in them just because they are. And then they're going to have some starches in them because they're a starchy, higher protein food. So that's a good example, where some others aren't as. So like vegetables, really high in fiber, very low in sugars, can be not at all having starches, depending on the vegetable. So that's a good example there. Sweet potatoes, really high in fiber, have sugars in them. That's why they're kind of sweet. And then starches, they're a starchier vegetable. So fats are found in a lot of things. So there's fats found in meats and fish and poultries. There's obviously fat. Oil is a fat, butter is a fat, cheese, milk, nuts, and nut butters. Those are also have just naturally have fat. Seeds, I talked about eggs, are all sources of fat. And really what we're trying to do, and we're trying to think, okay, like what am I going to make a meal? I'm going to try to think about a meal, and what do I want to include in that meal? And what I encourage people to start thinking about is I want to include a protein, a starch, or a sugar, kind of both, either or really, a fiber, and a fat in each of those meals. And a lot of times these foods can come from several. So like maybe we're doing a fiber. This fiber could be in the form of a vegetable, preferably, probably, but it could come from beans, for instance. And in a lot of ways, sometimes your protein could also be beans. So sometimes your meal can be really simple and you're only eating maybe a couple things rather than like 5 things or 4 things. Adding fat at a meal, I think people are sometimes afraid of fat, but fat helps us feel satisfied. Our body and our cells need fat as well, so it's important that we include some fat in moderation, of course. And then protein, our body just needs a lot of protein, so make sure we're eating protein. And then starches and sugars, those starchy, sugary carbohydrates, they sometimes get a bad rep, but they are very important for brain health. Our brains run exclusively off glucose, which is what is produced when our body breaks down carbohydrates. So having sugars and starches in our diet can really help keep our brain and our body healthy. So we always want to include those. And then when we talk about respecting satisfaction, these are just like, the motivation is not nourishment. The motivation is this is just good because food's good and food is to be enjoyed. And it's really like all our minds function best when we're not feeling deprived. I think that's a big piece here, is that when we feel deprived or we're not functioning at our best, I would say that's a mental health crisis if we're constantly feeling deprived about our food. And that can over time really translate into maybe some disordered eating behaviors that, it can be really challenging to work through. So sometimes satisfying foods are referred to as fun foods because foods are eaten for fun, and that's kind of what the point is. So how do we kind of like put these together? Well, first off, I guess, is like you would start asking yourself, what do I feel like eating today? And just what do I feel like eating today? Or is it, what do I feel like eating this week? Because if you're doing a whole meal plan, I guess, for the week, or what 3 meals am I really feeling like I want? And that's where you start asking yourself that. And that's where you're going to start. And we'll actually go to the next one, which is putting the nutrition and satisfaction together. So like putting it in like, okay, what actually sounds good to eat? Is there something that you're specifically craving? And then I guess the next question would be like, you're answering that. So you're going to ask yourself that, what is it? What do I actually sounds good to eat? And then what makes practical sense to eat? I think this is the next piece. It's like, is it always practical? You're like, yeah, what sounds really good is lobster. You're like, okay, but is it practical to eat lobster right now? Is that practical in my life right now? Maybe not. Maybe it is. Depends on where you're at, maybe. And then the next thing is like, what makes sense to eat? Is there food that needs to be eaten? Is there ingredients that are going to go bad? Do I have leftovers in my fridge I need to eat that I want to eat? Is there a budget concern? Am I trying to stick to a budget? Or is that not a concern? Is it a time thing? Maybe you're like, I want to make this big elaborate meal, but I don't have that much time to make that big elaborate meal tonight or this week. Or maybe this week's really crazy. I don't have that time. Maybe it's kitchen space, maybe it's equipment, maybe it's all sorts of things. So like, what is the actual practical piece of that? So you have kind of what you're craving, and then you're kind of thinking, okay, but what's actually more practical to eat? And are they going to be the same? And then what's the next thing we're going to start adding? Then you're start asking yourself, okay, what fiber, what fruit, what vegetable, what whole grain, what bean, what fat, what protein could I add to this meal? And then lastly, you would, yeah, and then you could, the next one would be what protein, what fat, what carb could be added to this meal. So you're kind of just asking yourself, first, what sounds satisfying, and then what piece of nutrition is missing from this meal, and how could I add it to this meal? So we'll do an example of, I don't know, let's say you are thinking, okay, I'm going to make some meals this week, and what sounds good? And you're like, you know what sounds really, really good? My homemade macaroni and cheese recipe. Sounds really good. I love macaroni and cheese. I haven't made it in a long time. I really want to make that. And you're like, okay, great. You're craving that. That's perfect. You figured out the first step. Okay. The next thing is like, hey, is this practical to make? And you're like, yeah, it's in my budget. It's, you know, I actually have some cheese I need to use, some cheddar cheese I have to use. So that's a great place to use it. So that makes practical sense to eat. And then you're thinking, okay, like it's macaroni and cheese. It does have protein in from the cheese. It's not, you know, it's not gonna be the highest protein meal, but it's gonna be vegetarian protein meal, which is great. And it's, you know, has carbohydrates. We got that because the pasta is gonna have carbs. It has some starchy carbohydrates, so that's great. But probably what's like lacking most of all is probably that vegetable component, that fiber component, if you will. So like what fiber is missing from this? And how could you add a fiber? So that's kind of what you're thinking. Like, okay, I'm gonna make macaroni and cheese. Maybe I'm going to put it on the calendar. We're going to do it on Wednesday. And it's got the carb component. There's definitely a fat component. There's a protein component. I could add another protein component to that possibly, but it's lacking that fiber component. So I have some options like, okay, should I plan to have a fruit with that? Should I plan to have a vegetable with that? Maybe I'm going to add a whole grain, or maybe I'm going to use a whole grain pasta. That could add some fiber. And then yeah, so then you're like thinking, okay, like, oh, I'm gonna make, remembered that you have a bag of frozen broccoli in your freezer that you need to use. So you're like, that's a perfect application for that frozen broccoli, is to make the macaroni and cheese with a side of broccoli. And then you're like, yeah, but I would also like to add some protein, and maybe there's a leftover, maybe you have some like leftover rotisserie chicken that you could easily add to that, or all sorts of, maybe you want to make some side chicken, or maybe you want to do a barbecue chicken and you could add a protein that way, or you could just call it a vegetarian meal, and you could have the vegetables and the macaroni and cheese and call it good, and that could be fine as well. So that would be kind of an example of like where we are first thinking what we're craving and then adding things into it so that we are including that nutrition standpoint. And this can be like done over and over and over again. And so that would be kind of an example. And that would actually be an example of, we talked about, I'm going to go back a sec, this kind of 3 meals method is like, if you were following that, that could be maybe the meal that you've made before, but you don't make it that often. And then you're thinking, okay, like got the macaroni and cheese meal. And then you're like, okay, I'm going to do one brand new recipe and meal. And maybe you're thinking, oh, I went to a restaurant last week and I had this really good pasta dish, or maybe you already had a pasta dish. So maybe you had these really great tacos, I don't know. And it had this like mango salsa stuff on top, and that sounded really good. And I think I want to try and recreate that. So that could be a brand new recipe. So maybe you do some Pinteresting, and you find something that's similar, or do a copycat Google search or Pinterest search. So that could be a brand new recipe. And then maybe there's like a plan for one meal that you make on a very regular basis. And so this could be something that you do very regularly, and you're just going to find ingredients for that one meal. And then you could just like call that good. And you can put it on your calendar if you want to, or you can just do the sporadic non-calendar approach depending on what you prefer, the flexibility or the structure. So perfect. Okay, and the next thing we're going to talk about just some potential barriers that can come from, I think, from meal planning, or when we're thinking about meal planning. I think a big one is the picky eating one. So this is a really, 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 really common one. Picky eaters, yes, kids, adults, all sorts of people. It's very common for a patient to say, well, or they'll say, I'll ask if they like incorporate a lot of different foods into when they make meals at home, and they say, well, no, because my kids don't eat it, or I'm just at a loss because they just won't eat anything, and so we just go out. And it's frustrating. I totally validate that frustration. And I always try to kind of approach it with this idea that picky eaters will not be picky forever, especially if you expose them to other foods. That's kind of like the biggest key point here is that, especially with kids, I should say this is specifically to kids, though I know there are a lot of adult picky eaters, that exposure is like the key component here, because kids learn to eat by watching you eat. That is very true. And like, even if your kid doesn't eat the food, so like even if you are serving the broccoli and the kid's not eating the broccoli, you are still exposing that kid to that food, and that kid probably, in very likelihood, later on will come to think of that food as an acceptable food, and start eating it. That's just because it's an exposure thing. And I was kind of like to explain it that, like, if you never serve vegetables to a kid because they, the first couple times they just rejected it and they never ate it, and so you're like, I'm not trying again, they don't like it, then it becomes kind of like a foreign food, if you will, meaning that it's just a food that is scary because it's just not something they're exposed to. And so, and you maybe like can identify or like understand that, thinking about like maybe an actual foreign food from another culture and country, that you look at it and you're like, I can't believe people eat that there. That just seems like such a very different food. And it's just, they're like, it's just such a normal food. For example, I did my master's degree in Scotland, and they eat some interesting food there sometimes, particularly a lot of meat type things and pies and like ground minced meat and things. And one particular, it's a cultural food, it's called haggis, and it essentially is just like all the unused meat from like a lamb specifically, and they cook it in a sheep's stomach, and then you like chop it up and eat it. And like it's like a really common food there. And to me, that was a very foreign food, and I was not exposed to it as a child. But you would just like watch everyone, all your Scottish friends, just like, this is like a good food, and everyone loves it, and they're just devouring it, and I'm just like, whoa, this is like not what I'm used to. And I did try it, and I did like it. Though I will say I like they make a vegan version. I'm not a vegan, but I did like the vegan one. Because it's just like lentils and stuff. But it is like, that's kind of the same principle, is if your kid at home isn't exposed to maybe broccoli, then in their adult life, when they're, continually exposed to that broccoli, they'll be like, I don't like this food. It's not something I ate growing up, and so therefore I don't like it. And it doesn't really matter, like, if the kid doesn't eat it. That's kind of what the research says. Like, even if the kid's not eating that broccoli, doesn't mean that it's not working, because it's kind of just like exposure therapy, if you will. The more you see it, the more you see it, the more they see it, the more likely they are on their own volition to give it a try, and then the more likely they are to like that food. But it takes a while, and it's like kind of a slow process, and kids are just naturally really picky. It's part of like them growing up and becoming who they are. So it definitely takes a lot of patience. So yeah, and then like other thing too, and like this can be kind of a tricky subject, but like, don't force the kid to eat it. A lot of the research says that you like, there's a lot of research about feeding kids, and they kind of put the responsibility in two areas. So the parent is responsible for providing the food, and the kid is responsible for eating that food and how much of that food. And so as the parent, maybe your responsibility is to expose that kid to that food, and then that kid's responsibility is to actually eat that food and how much of that food. And so not forcing it, actually, like, forcing it could potentially cause like a negative association with it, versus if they're just exposed, and then one day they try it and they're like, wow, this is really delicious. They're more likely to think that than if they're just kind of forced to eat it. So what dietitians that actually work with kids and families, what they recommend is encouraging like the food to be on their plate, but not forcing them to eat it. So the broccoli is sitting on the plate, a small portion, one floret literally, and it has to sit there. That's the family rule, but they don't have to eat it. And then over time, that can expose. That's how you expose kids to new foods and new textures and new flavors and everything else. It's just a constant kind of exposure therapy. And then always provide at least one safe food at each meal, because ultimately your kid's willing to eat. So I get that. Like, you're not going to have the entire meal, all these new foods that they don't like. It's maybe one food, and the rest of the foods are safe foods. So a safe food essentially would just be a food that your kid will eat and like and enjoy, so that it's something they will still eat something at that meal. And so when you're planning your meal, so we're doing this meal plan idea, and you have of course you're thinking of your family and your kids when you're planning your meal, because they're going to be eating it too. And so you think, okay, like I know my kid doesn't eat the broccoli, but I like broccoli, and I know my significant other, my spouse likes broccoli, and I know maybe my other kid likes broccoli. So I'm going to still make broccoli, but and we're also making barbecue chicken, which I know my other kid still doesn't like barbecue chicken, but I know he'll eat the macaroni and cheese, and so that's a safe food. Or sometimes it's even encouraged, like if there's like a lot of unsafe foods at a meal, because you have a really picky eater, to provide one or two safe foods with the meal that everyone kind of eats. So it looks like everyone's part of the meal, like such as like crackers on the table, chopping up some cheese or something that looks like it's part of the meal that are safe foods for that one child who maybe has some more pickier tendencies. So, but yeah, I would always provide safe foods, but don't be afraid to have foods that maybe the kid would be exposed to. That could be a good thing as well. Okay, the next one is just another really common one, I think, is the no time. And yeah, so I'm just like feeling like there's no time, and that's why you don't meal plan, because there's no time to make those meals and actually execute them. And like I kind of said before, it's like life is so busy, and it's just like not always so reasonable and so simple to just say, rearrange your priorities, put food and meal planning higher on your priority list. And it's like, there's so many things require so many things, so much of your time. So I get it. So there are some tips and tricks on how to make it easier, or just more likely that the execution will actually happen. So there's kind of like you could prep ahead of time. And so is like where it makes sense, really. So like, for instance, like you could slow cook chicken for various meals. So, you're going to make this pot of chicken, and you're going to use it for tacos sometime in the week. You're going to use it for maybe burritos sometime in the week. You're going to make a soup with it. You're going to use it in some casseroles. You're going to put it in some salads, etc., etc., etc. And sometimes I'll even encourage this as like you are slow cooking this as kind of like thing on your to-do list, not as a meal. So for instance, like, okay, I know I have time on Sunday. I'm just going to be hanging out at home, or maybe I'm not even going to be at home because I have a crock pot, and I'm just going to slow cook this chicken so that it's shredded chicken and it's seasoned and flavored and everything, so that it can be eaten throughout the week with various meals. So it's not something you're going to eat immediately, but something you're planning really literally and doing ahead of time for various meals throughout the week. So that could be a way you could like prep ahead of time, because sometimes the protein portion, or if you're doing a meat, that protein portion can be the most time consuming part of the meal. So getting that done ahead of time can make a meal come together much quicker in the evening. Or in the afternoon, if you're taking like meals, if you're wanting to bring more meals for like lunch instead of like eating out for lunch, another great way. So you don't have to do any like prep in the morning beyond just like putting in a container, or you can do that the night before. Another prep ahead of time you can do is like wash and chop veggies, where depending on the type of vegetable, some you don't want to chop beforehand, but so like, yeah, if you know, like, okay, I'm going to do this meal and I have a ton of time on a Sunday afternoon, and I just kind of want to get some things over and done with and put it on my to-do list for meals, and I know I'm going to be making something later in the week that requires chopped onions, I'm just going to go ahead and chop that onion now, put it in a plastic baggie. You could either put it in your freezer if it's not going to be till later of the week, or just put it in your fridge and it'll be fine. Peppers, like bell peppers, you could just chop those, put them in a bag or in a container. Carrots do really well pre-chopped. Sweet potatoes, broccoli, things that just taking that one step out so that the execution just comes together so much quicker, because I totally understand the feeling of like, I'm hungry right now, my family's hungry right now, I don't have that much time to prepare a meal. And all these like chopping and washing and cooking meat can be sometimes like the most time consuming part. So getting that all ahead of time when you have time and you can, you're not rushed, that can be a good place. That can be something you can plan ahead of time. And again, going back to like, if you have like on the schedule and you have put on your calendar, like I'm going to eat this food on this day, then you can better kind of anticipate what you could prep ahead of time. Because if you don't know exactly when you're going to eat it, it can be a little bit more challenging. But if you know exactly I'm going to eat this on this day, this evening, I'm going to chop it, I'm going to use it that day. That can be helpful. Other things is you could use partially prepared foods. So I think some people like, oh, it's cheating if I used a pre-seasoned frozen vegetable bag. It's not cheating. There's no right or wrong way to eat a vegetable, in my opinion. And these can be really helpful depending on your lifestyle. And so this is, again, like sometimes priorities, they ebb and flow, and sometimes like food and meal prep is just not going to be as high as, and sometimes it's going to be higher. So that's okay. So yeah, using partially prepared foods, like using a rotisserie chicken, because that just like you don't have to cook it, it's already done. You can just slice it and use the meat for something. That's a really great way to plan a meal with partially prepared food. I literally did this like 2 days ago, actually. I knew I had a long work day, and I knew I was feeding some friends after work because I had already pre-planned that, and I had planned ahead of time. Well, I was like planned ahead of time, like, okay, it's hot. I don't want to turn my oven on. That was actually a big motivation for this. And I just like, I don't have a ton of time. I'm going home from work and I have like 30 minutes before they're coming over. So I'm going to plan to get a rotisserie chicken. And that's what I did. I got a rotisserie chicken. I chopped it up, used that meat in another dish. And it was fine. I'm glad I did it. No regrets. You could use like pre-made fresh salsa. That's an example. Or like the last one, pre-chopped fresh vegetables and fruit. So like in the grocery store in the produce section, I think it's usually it's not in the middle section, it's in the refrigerated produce section. Usually kind of like where they have like bags of lettuce and stuff. They'll have like little containers of pre-chopped onion and pre-chopped all sorts of other vegetables. And that's a really great way to just like, if time is an issue and you have a really busy life, which totally understandable, that's a really great way to still make it so that meals happen at your home more often or more likely. And then pre-seasoned frozen vegetables, that's a great option. I always encourage that, honestly. It's like all you have to do is put it in the microwave, put it up, pull it out, and there you have a vegetable. If you have a hard time adding that fiber component or that vegetable component to your meals, you know, and partly it's because you don't like to chop vegetables, it's just time consuming and they go bad in your fridge, opt for frozen options. That's not a bad way. So I think that's a good thing, and I think we're pretty much done. Yeah. So, oh, I think I was going to mention a couple other things, just that like people ask about like the meal planning services like HelloFresh. Honestly, it's a great option depending on your lifestyle. It's definitely a little bit more expensive depending compared to just like going to the grocery store and meal planning yourself. But it can be a great option depending on your lifestyle and where your like motivation is. So yeah, no problems with those. I think it's a good option. Or HelloFresh is great, and then all the other type of similar HelloFresh, like Thrive, I think is another one that's also really good. So those could be a good option. I think that's pretty much it. Do you guys have any questions? Thank you for coming and listening to me today.
Josie, can you see the questions down in the chat box?
Yes.
Okay, I'm gonna let you look at those.
Perfect. Okay, yes. Thank you for listening. If you guys have any questions, please just use the chat box and answer me. And it looks like Tina said, I love the plate and silverware. Great for kids. Yes. I think referring to the picture. Yeah, that is cute. I saw that and I liked it as well.
There's one that says, as a dietitian, would you recommend following the TDEE and macro counting? This is my current struggle because I'm trying to meal plan. Is this a practical form of eating and planning?
Okay, wait, sorry. I don't know if I can see these questions.
Okay, so Gina, she's asking about the TDEE and macro counting, if that's a good practical way for eating and meal planning.
Yeah, that's a good question. I am not familiar with the TED. Sorry, I can't see it. I would read it. But macro counting, yeah. I think it depends. I think the problem sometimes with macro counting is that it can get really tedious. I think that's the thing. And sometimes like tedious can be maybe a big barrier to being like doing meal planning long term and successfully. So I think it's definitely possible. And I think it just kind of depends on like if it helps. Like some people it can be helpful because it's like, okay, I need this many grams of protein, so I'm gonna, and that can help kind of guide them or guide you to like what you're gonna choose for your meals. So that's a good option, I think. But it can also be limiting, just because I think it can be limiting on that satisfaction part, frankly, meaning that like you just sometimes don't feel like eating. Like you feel like eating is more of a certain macro and less of another macro, and I think over time like it's not as sustainable long term, just because if we're missing that, and I think that's kind of why I included the satisfaction piece, because long term success for any type of eating pattern and lifestyle, it's your life at the end of the day, and so you have to like what you're doing and like what you're eating, and for it to be like long-term successful. So I guess that's kind of where macro counting can sometimes be a little complicated, because sometimes it's not as enjoyable to eat by counting macros. So, but I think it can definitely, again, like help guide a meal plan and start thinking about what types of foods based on like, you have to get X amount of calories or macros or grams of certain macronutrient. Did I answer that question?
Okay, the other one says, expenditure, a measure of how many calories you burn a day. Perfect. I agree. Long-term success is super important. And the other, Lisa said that you did answer her question correctly.
Oh, perfect. Sorry, was there another question or was that just a comment?
No. Are there any other questions before we close this presentation? And we got lots of thank you for your time.
Oh, perfect. Thank you for coming, listening to me.
Okay, so thank you everyone for coming. We will be doing another presentation with BD Medical pretty soon. Thank you, Josie, for coming, and we'll talk to everybody soon. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And if also you participated, make sure to email me or submit your points on WellRight for your Sandy Total Wellness Incentive points.